I'm Shirley DeVoe, and a nurse veteran of World War II. This is an effort to share memories of my experiences in World War II, which hopefully will give you a small picture of nursing at that time. I would like to tell you about my basic nursing preparation and why I decided to join the military. Let me tell you of some of my personal experiences as a military nurse. On coming home, I had many different emotions, perhaps which can best be expressed by a note which I wrote in August of 1946. It says, "Here ends the story that started over 3 years ago, July 5th, 1943 to August 13th, 1946. I've lived, worked, and loved halfway around the world, Florida, California, and the Philippines. I've known laughter and sunshine, the warm comradeship of so many, many wonderful people, and the rending heartache such as nothing else like war can bring. Many dearly loved ones live now only in my heart. I'm tired, terribly tired, and need time to find myself again and gain new strength to carry on. I hope that I've done my job well. I've tried. Perhaps eventually the bruises will heal and I can find some measure of contentment. Perhaps these 3 years have held too much of joy and tears, but I know the imprint of them will remain with me for the rest of my life. My one great hope is that the peoples of this world have found that there's room for all to live in harmony." Graduated from a 3-year hospital program. That was the probably about 99, 91, 100% of nursing students came from that type of program at that point in time. I also was very fortunate in being in a very progressive environment where going on to college was encouraged, and I had the benefit of being able to go on to the university at Buffalo and receiving a baccalaureate degree in nursing. Meanwhile, World War II had started. And it's a little bit hard in this day and age to reflect back entirely because society has changed so much and the attitudes have changed so much. And it would probably sound strange to you if I said it was a popular war. Not in the sense of people wanting to have war or being killed or anything of that sort, but because this country had been attacked by the Japanese in Hawaii, it united people as they've probably never been united since. And everybody seemed to pull together to do whatever was necessary in order to achieve the desired results. I think probably the sense of citizenship and personal responsibility for that was at its very height in this country. Whether it will ever occur again or not, well, let's say maybe I hope not, because I hope we never have that type of war again. But for those of us who were young, everybody we knew was going in service. I know at the hospital where I worked, the young physicians, they finished their internship and every single one of them went on active duty immediately following this, so that the temper was to do this. I don't know if I can't answer the question of would I have gone anyway? Possibly yes, but what really made the war come home to me was the death of somebody who was very close to me. And that made the war seem very personal. And so I felt I just had to go, that I had to be part, that I had to complete the job that this young man had started. And so I enlisted in what was then called the Army Air Corps as a nurse. This, of course, eventually became the separate organization of the Air Forces, but at that time it was part of the Army. And as a single person, I took off on a train one night and ended up in Tallahassee, Florida, at Mabry Field, which was an air station. The program there was designed primarily to train young men as fighter pilots. And we supplied the medical attention that was necessary for them. It It was quite a learning experience for me because I had spent my nursing career up to that time in a very active teaching hospital with a lot of high-powered surgery and care and things of this sort. And suddenly I was dropped into a small hospital which was devoted mainly to small, unusual, little problems that people would have, which normally were only taken care of in doctors' offices. Because in the military, you either had to be fit for full duty or you were in the hospital. So I learned an awful lot about people, I think more so than I ever had before, and their interreactions, and how to learn to be a supportive person to help these young men in any way that I could to face the future that they were going to be facing and to deal with problems. They were away from home, they were separated, they were sometimes having problems with their girlfriends and what have you, and I got to be a great listener and what have you, and felt that it was a part of what was necessary to do at that point in time. I also began to find that, yes, this was a whole different environment. For the first time in my life, I had patients with malaria. And this was something I'd only read about in textbooks. And suddenly we had an invasion of young flyers who had been over in North Africa who came back with malaria and needed that kind of treatment. We had to learn to deal with air crashes. We had one crash which we suddenly received 30 patients critically ill in this little hospital, and yet by good organization, all these young men were taken care of and were on their way to recovery in about 24 hours. All the definitive surgery had been done, and everything was done to put them back on their feet and get them going. It also opened up another different world. They did try to help us understand how the different men in their different organizations, how they lived, they worked, and things of this sort. We did things like this. We went to camouflage school. We learned how to camouflage. We went through the obstacle course. They trained us in the various things, like we learned how to march and how to salute and do all the little things that were specifically military. One other thing that we did there, which was kind of interesting from a nursing point of view, this community had very little to offer in the way of medical assistance. And we did have a lot of young women who were wives of the young flyers who were there, and many of them were pregnant. So the only thing we could do was to somehow or other meet their needs, and we started an OB department. And we did this, first of all, the officers' wives earned money for us so that we could buy the instruments and things that were needed. At that point in time, the military did not take care of dependents, but they did say you can have, quote, a building. So that was all we started with. The original bassinets were orange crates. When Father came in to see his wife at night, he went home with dirty diapers and dirty shirts and things like that to take care of the laundry, because we had no means of doing laundry. It was quite an interesting situation. But over a period of the 18 months that I was there, we developed an excellent first-rate OB department. We had bassinets. We had everything you can think about in a well-operating OB department. And at that point in time, we were delivering about 600 babies a year, which was a pretty good operation for a 150-bed hospital. After 18 months, one day I came off duty. We used to work split time. We were working 12-hour shifts. And if it wasn't, the work wasn't too heavy, why, you did have a period maybe of 2 or 3 hours break. Came off with another friend for a break, and we were going out for coffee. And I ran into the chief nurse as I was coming down the corridor, and she said to me, "You're leaving for California tonight." And I said, "Thank you." I went down the corridor until I got to my friend. And in shock, I said, "Mary, I'm going to California tonight, 3,000 miles away." Cleaned out my room, packed my bags, and they put me on a train around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was off to California. 5 days later, transferring in several trains and what have you, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the train stopped in the middle of the darkness. I got off, the train took off, and I was the only one there. in the dark. And I thought, what am I going to do? Here I am, 3,000 miles in the pitch dark. But an MP little Jeep came up, and they took me up to headquarters, had me sign in, took me to the hospital, and the nurse who was on duty found a bed for me to sleep in. We were originally slated to go overseas with a unit at that point in time. But there had been a little bit of error in the way our orders have been issued, and consequently, we were notified at our original stations that we were to leave to go to the next station the same day that we were supposed to have gone overseas. So the hospital at Camp Robertson, California, which was an infantry training center, had to pull 13 nurses from their staff, send them with the overseas unit, and then we came in and filled in those 13 positions for a period of about 8 months. Eventually, one day, again, I got orders, and I left for a staging area in Northern California. From there, we went to Southern California, and one day boarded a ship, a little ship, which was designated the little Evangeline. It was built for the a Caribbean cruise to hold 150 people. There were 1,500 of us on this ship, and we plowed the Pacific Ocean by ourselves. We had a Navy gun crew on, but that was about all. We zigzagged across the Pacific. It took us 26 days on the ship before we finally ended up in the Philippines. Now, a pro of that, giving you a little time of war, before we left for overseas, we were issued winter gear, galoshes, wool liners for our jackets, all these things. We were sure we were going to Alaska or someplace. Nobody knew where you were going, you know. You just got in a boat and they took you someplace. And here we ended up in Manila, and the temperature was 120 degrees. Fortunately, they did have an issue of khaki slacks and shirts for us, because I think we would have been pretty ridiculous running around galoshes and wool underwear. And we spent a few days in Manila staging, and then we were sent by ambulance up through Luzon to probably about midway of the island on the west shore on the China Sea, and to what was called Base M. And Base M had been established for the invasion of Japan. It was loaded. You went by miles and miles and miles of equipment and supplies piled up ready to go. And there were 2 or 3 different hospitals that were staging there. As you can appreciate, living conditions in any one of these environments was pretty difficult. I have said since that there was a time in my life I lived with such a minimum of basic food, clothing, and shelter that I felt I would never again feel any sense of being in want, because I'd learned to live with such a small amount. To give you an example, when I left Manila to go up to the upper part of the island, they had told us that we could have 1 piece of hand luggage. They suggested that we pack at least a change or 2 of clothing, which we did. Since our luggage was rather small, that we were permitted, a group of us kind of got together. One person took shoe polish, you know, another person took laundry soap. We kind of divvied up these things, and it was good we did, because we ended up in a tent for 10, and we lived for about 3.5 months with no more personal belongings than was in that one little suitcase. But we learned, we helped each other out. Instead of everybody washing every night, why, 2 of us would wash every night, and we washed for the whole tent. And we passed the job along, so you only washed about every 5 days, did laundry about every 5 days. Working conditions, the hospitals consisted of a piece of cement like a driveway, and over this had been erected a tin roof, and the sides of the building consisted of a matting of swalling, and that just kind of went around the building. Housekeeping was great. All you had to do was pour water on the cement and sweep it out the sides. But we still were able to give patients very good care. And by standards, I would say probably excellent care that was given to them, even though these circumstances were very primitive. I've racked my brain many times, and maybe it's the nice thing that passage of time makes you forget the pain, makes you forget the hardships, makes you forget how uncomfortable, how unbearable you were. You know, where there are times when you were sweaty and dirty, and that you could, if you were lucky, you got a bucket of water. Water was premium to wash in. And then, so you washed, and then you washed your clothes and whatever was left over, because that's all that you had. But those memories kind of fade. And the thing that's most wonderful to remember is all the wonderful people I met. People from all over this country, from all different nationalities, different racial groups, each who made their own contribution and became a very, very special part of my memory. There was such a feeling of unity. There was such a looking after each other, of trying to, each of us trying to make the other person's life a little more comfortable, a little bit better. And it didn't matter whether you were an officer, enlisted, a man or a woman. Everybody kind of looked out for everybody else. And one evening we were at the Engineers Club, and there was a young engineer who I'd met who was going home the next day. And sure, he was having a couple beers with the fellows and talking and what have you. But tears were running down this young man's cheeks. And he said, I want to go home more than I want to do anything else in this world. But oh, if I could only take all of you with me. Because he kind of knew, I guess, that the kind of friendships that you form under circumstances of adversity never stop. They're always there. They continue. And I know this has been true with me. I have friends who I talk with usually a couple times a year. Some of them I haven't seen in 30 or 40 years, but we still have something in common, and we still share that. I think we grew in many, many different ways. First of all, some of the procedures that we were not taught as students and were strictly the physician's prerogative, during the war became the nurse's responsibility because of numbers. There was probably maybe one nurse or one doctor for 300 or 400 patients. There was maybe one nurse per 100 patients really on duty at one time. But I learned to take blood pressures, which I had never done before. I learned to start on intravenous, occasionally transfusion, and things of this nature, which were not nursing, per se. I think one other big outcome, which certainly has affected the future of nursing tremendously, was the GI Bill of Rights. As I mentioned to you before, I had a baccalaureate degree before I went on active duty. But I was rare. I never met another nurse all the time I was on active duty who had a baccalaureate degree. I kind of kept it hidden, I thought it was something I didn't want to. I certainly didn't brag about it, but I think nurses felt this strong need for more education and a more diversified education, and the GI Bill made it financially possible for many of them to go on and get baccalaureate degrees. Also, the programs of moving schools of nursing out of hospitals and into colleges and universities had its big push, I think, at that period of time. And now, I don't know if there are any hospital schools of nursing. I'm sure there are some in the country. But by and large, the vast majority of nurses are now being taught in educational institutions. None of us appreciate how much ability we have, how much courage we have, until we are faced with sometimes what seems almost impossible. To realize that every single woman probably who has ever gone to war with the troops has been frightened, worried, wondered what would happen, and what have you. But she had to put her own fears aside because she was taking care of sick young men. And she had to be courageous. She had to have a smile on her face. And she had to face whatever had to be done in order to achieve her goal as a professional person. And I think that every single nurse would find that when really challenged, that she would come through and she would face what was necessary in order to take care of her patients.